Okay, so before we really dive into the topic of short fiction, I was hoping that each of you could just tell us a little bit about yourselves and who you are as a writer. Troy, we can start with you.
Yeah, so I'm Chaitali Sen is my author name. And I am the author of a novel, The Pathless Sky, that came out in 2015. And I've written quite a lot of short stories, and I've been published in literary magazines such as Ecotone, Shenandoah, New England Review, Chicago Quarterly Review, Colorado Review. I'm happy to talk about submissions and things like that. And I just finished another novel, which was being shopped in the middle of a pandemic, so the outcome is unknown. And I am also trying to finish a couple of short stories right now. And I think actually my head is more into short fiction at the moment. So, and I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. What about you, Mary Helen?
I'm also really happy to be here, and especially with Troy too, whose work I love. I started off as a short story writer, so in my 20s, that's kind of was my passion, was writing and reading, and trying to publish my short stories. And then when I was about 30, I got the novel bug, and so I published a novel, Migratory Animals, and I've written a second one, like Troy T. I'm also hoping that will get bought sometime soon. And kind of in between the novel projects, I've continued to do short fiction. Often there's an idea, something that comes to me that just isn't right for the novel form. And so I love to kind of have kind of both parts of my brain kind of, looking for ideas. Is this a big novel idea? Is this a shorter, potentially short story idea? And so when I can, I try to have multiple projects kind of going at the same time.
Yeah, I love that because you're both also novelists and short story writers. And so, Mary Helen, you already kind of talked about, coming to short fiction first, but Troy, which came first for you? And also, could the both of you maybe talk a little bit about, the different brains that you use for each form and maybe what you learn when you're translating from one to the other? So Troy?
Well, I guess like a lot of writers, I started out doing short stories just because you think they're shorter and you can have some immediate gratification, but it doesn't actually work that way. I mean, for me, a short story can take a long time. But I think I'm, when I'm writing a short story, I actually think it is a different set of skills. I think I'm using a more mathematical part of my brain, almost like it's almost like putting together a puzzle because it's so compressed, and with a novel I'm just much more free form and open and just kind of exploratory, whereas with a short story, if I don't know early enough what I'm trying to say, it often just doesn't get finished. So there's something about what is this moment I'm trying to capture in a short story, and then how am I putting all these pieces together? So I do feel like it's a very different part of my brain. And I will say here that I love writing short stories. I think writing novels comes easier for me. And when I'm writing a short story and I finish one that I'm satisfied with, I'm really amazed at what I've accomplished. Whereas with a novel, I'm happy with it, but it wasn't the struggle actually that went into me putting a short story together, just because I think I'm more naturally a novelist. So.
Thank you, Mary Helen.
I would say that for me, the novel is actually really, really hard, mostly because of the structure. It's so hard to visualize at one time, whereas with the short story, you can kind of see it all. But I really agree with what Troy said in terms of this idea of compression and the looseness of versus the looseness of a novel. One of the things that I really find is a great short story should have no word out of place. There's like this precision, this kind of sharp punch in a really good short story. But a novel, I mean, obviously you want your care about language in a novel, obviously too, but there's a looseness, kind of like a baggy quality to novels. They can kind of absorb a lot more, I don't want to say mistakes, but kind of. Whereas a short story, there's really no room for that. And even though structurally they're very different, at least for me in terms of when I'm thinking about them, I'm really glad that I did do short stories first, because I feel like I learned a lot of skills that do transfer, just in terms of dialogue versus summarized dialogue, making quick transitions, grabbing a reader quickly, you know, a lot of the skills, making a setting do more than just be background, but actually put pressure on your characters or on your plot. All of these things that stories really have to have, most of them, to function. I think those skills do end up being useful in the novel writing process as well, even though the structure is so different.
Yeah, and we are talking about short fiction, and that can come in a lot of forms. And so I think there's been this big boom in flash fiction. And so I'm wondering if you can also talk a little bit about that, and, you know, and that's an even more compressed form. And so what are some tools that every writer should probably be thinking about when you're approaching like such a short piece?
Well, I love the flash genre. To me, you can use some really interesting concepts, almost more like poetry. So like in poetry, you know, you have lots of different forms. So you can be like, okay, I'm going to write a sonnet, and I've got this many, you know, this many lines, and it has to rhyme in this scheme. In fiction, we don't tend to think of having that, but actually, when you have flash fiction, you can kind of almost play a game with yourself. You can, I have my students do a flash fiction piece often that each sentence starts with the subsequent letter of the alphabet. So the first sentence starts with A, the next sentence with B. And so your story has to end in exactly 26 sentences. And so you have to find a way to create that arc and think about the way you're using language. And I love kind of playing kind of games like that with myself in flash fiction, because it really forces me out of my habits, the ways I might just kind of usually start a sentence, or the way I might usually kind of think of a character. So I think flash fiction is a really fun kind of genre to strengthen all of your little writer muscles.
Yeah, that's awesome. Choity?
Well, I should take Mary Helen's class. But I mean, yeah, I think flash fiction is, to me, it's more, I think the skills that you use to write poetry are very useful in flash fiction, where I think in flash, it's not only the story you're trying to tell, and whether that actually has whether that has merit as a story, but you're also thinking about, I think language is even more, it's just even more important in flash fiction, where the person who's sitting with the story for 2 or 3 minutes has to get value from a lot of things, but it's also telling a story. So it's different from just reading a poem. I think flash fiction is also, it's fun. It's something that can help you work on a lot of skills. I think it's a very hard genre.
Yeah.
But I do enjoy reading it a lot.
Yeah, sometimes, like you were mentioning, Trudy, earlier, that just because a short story is shorter than a novel doesn't mean it takes less time to write. And of course, with flash fiction, I think it's similar. Sometimes my students think, oh, if it's only 1 page, how hard could it be? But actually, in a lot of ways, it's harder to make a satisfying story in that amount of time. Yeah.
Yeah, and so how do you approach that? Like, what does your process look like when you're writing short stories? Like, for a novel especially, like people always say, like, you want to outline because it's just this massive thing that you're trying to wrangle. And so what do you do when you're writing a short story?
For me, one of the things that I really love about short stories is that I can be a lot more experimental in how I approach them. With a novel, you know, I'm aware that I'm going to be, if it goes well, I'm going to be looking at years with this project, right? And with this character. So I'm never going to pick a protagonist that has a skill or a way of speaking or something that I don't think I can maintain as a writer for that long. But with short stories, I can try anything. I'm not a particularly funny writer, but with short stories, I can try, and maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But I haven't invested 3 years, right? And I don't have to make it work for 300 pages. So for me, that's the really the joy of writing a short story, is that you can be really stylistically experimental. I can try genres I might otherwise be kind of resistant to trying in a longer work. And so my process really for short stories is kind of to throw a bunch of things at the wall and see what sticks. And then when I feel like, oh, that voice is working, or that scene has some kind of magic to it, then I'll kind of keep unspooling that and kind of working on it. But I also throw away a lot of story ideas that don't have that magic on the page.
Yeah. What about you, Choity?
Yeah, it's similar for me. I mean, I think I do also throw a lot of stuff at the wall and see what sticks. I usually start, there's a character or situation that's really speaking to me, or even sometimes it's just like one line that I heard, and it sparks something, and I want to work it into a story. So it is a good way to bring in things that you don't want to wait years to bring this really great line of dialogue into a novel, where it won't fit. Often it's a spark like that for me, just something that's just a nugget. It's not anywhere near a story yet. And then I think of characters in a situation around that. And then at some point I have gotten more into doing like a series of questions or like exercises around a story, just to figure out what it's about. And I found a really great one that actually is for playwriting. I got it from the open courseware from MIT. And it just asks questions like, why are your characters coming together on this day to have this discussion? I mean, that's how it is in the play, but I found it very applicable to writing a short story. Why this day? Why now? Why these people? And I sometimes it's nice to like just figure that out, do some exercises, do some journaling, and then suddenly you understand why you're writing the short story.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I actually am so glad you mentioned that. That's actually, I think, one of the key differences too between thinking about a short story, like you're saying, is like, why today? One of my professors in graduate school used to say, into what life has this trouble come? That was great. They'd ask us to think about, where's the trouble? Why is this the day that we're beginning? Most short stories don't start with the day that a character is born and end on the day that they die. Most of them are picking a kind of compressed moment in that character's life. And so kind of making sure you're really thinking about that as a writer.
Yeah, that's great. And so we're already approaching the halfway point for this conversation. So we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the business of short fiction. And so Choity, you already mentioned that you're happy to talk about submissions. So will you kind of explain what the submission process looks like for short fiction, and maybe some ways that you can stay informed about, what journals are like looking for submissions and stuff like that?
Yes, so it's changed a lot since I first started submitting. So when I started submitting, it was all done through the mail. You put your stuff into a big envelope, and with a self-addressed stamped envelope where you never heard the answer. And it was a very slow, kind of painstaking process, and it's been sped up by these, things like Submittable, where most journals now actually prefer electronic submissions. And but all of my stories until recently were just picked out of the slush pile. And usually what would happen is I'd send out a batch, and then I'd get some either form rejections, which meant the story was not connecting, or I would get very encouraging rejections, which told me that I was onto something and that this was really worth improving. And so, you know, there's a little bit of a trial and error process to it. And then when I got my first acceptance, my first major acceptance from New England Review like 10 years ago, it was a game changer for me. Like, not that that meant that everything was accepted after that, but it just gave me this confidence that actually I could do this. And, but you have to submit a lot. You know, you write a lot, you submit a lot, and you learn from that process of submission. And the Poets and Writers website, I would go through those journals and just see what they were looking for. I read a lot of journals. I would just go to the bookstore and browse through them. And the Duotrope, I used that for a while. That now they charge money. And then there's this really great list of the Pushcart Prize winners that Clifford Garstang puts together. And I use that list a lot. But and then, you know, I did after a while learn, you know, I would meet editors at conferences, and you know, after you have a little experience under your belt, it is okay to send an email to an editor and say, hey, I have this piece, would you look at it? You know, I don't think you should like overdo it, but you know, it's definitely something, once you get some experience with it and some publications under your belt, when you have a really strong piece, I will sometimes go straight to an editor.
Nice. Mary Helen, anything to add?
Well, I love this idea of that she was talking about reading different literary magazines yourself. I think not only can that give you a good, better sense of which publications might be a good match for the kinds of stories that you're writing, but it also gives you a really good idea of what is currently out there. Because when you're trying to get a piece accepted out of the slush pile, you want to make sure that you have something a little bit special. And so if you are, you know, really reading the journals and seeing the kinds of things that people are submitting and publishing, it can keep you from, you know, opening your story with something that's becoming a cliche, because, you know, 5 other stories this year have that similar opening, right? You get a kind of a sense of that and how you might be able to position yourself as a little bit different. So I think that's something to be considering, especially when you're just submitting it from the slush pile and hoping that it connects, because often they're not going to read past the first page if something doesn't connect with them in those first few paragraphs. They're under no obligation to read the whole story, and so really kind of keeping that in mind, in particular when you're submitting to journals.
Yeah, and can you name maybe a few journals that people could look into to submit?
Well, it really depends on what kind of stuff you're writing.
Yeah.
I love American short fiction. Granted, they're an Austin magazine, but they're also one of the best in the country too. And I really love them because even though they, you know, are very literary and they get a lot of their writers go on to do kind of great literary things, they also are really open to things that have kind of magical realism or fantastical elements, or that think stylistically outside the box. So I really love the work that they publish for that reason.
Chaitali, do you have any journals that you'd like to shout out?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it depends a lot on what you're writing. So there are really, like, if you're writing sci-fi, there are magazines that actually pay better than literary magazines for that kind of work. And, you know, I don't write in that genre, but there are ways you can find out who, you know, where to publish in those genres. For literary magazines, I definitely second American Short Fiction. I really love the magazines that have a focus on place, and there are place, and often there's a nature or science kind of theme to a lot of the issues. So Ecotone is one of my favorites. And I also really like The Common, which also focuses on place. And they have a disc that they, at least I think they still do, on their website, you can see a section called Dispatches, and they're just really short little pieces that highlight where the setting really is important to what's being communicated in the whole piece. There are so many good ones out there, but you know, of course, I'm partial to ones that have published my work also. So I do really like Colorado Review and New England Review. And then there are really exciting things happening with online literary journals now, because you know, the cost of printing is expensive, and a lot have gone on to online. That's where most people are reading stories. So you know, I think it's important to look at online outlets like Shenandoah, and I can't think of any others right now, but there's a lot, but those are the ones that I like.
Cool. So
that's actually a good point, just because early on when I started, I used to feel like if I got something in a print literary journal that it was like more important or something, I could hold it in my hand. But actually my work that has been published in places that are online, like Hobart, I've gotten a lot more responses from it, because it's just easier to access. People can go and click on that story at Hobart, where they're not going to go probably buy a back issue of the Georgia Review from 2007. And so I agree. I think that a lot of those online magazines have a lot of reach. So
yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, so this will be our last question for the conversation, and then we'll move to the breakout rooms. But just to close, a big part of being a writer is also reading, in the genres that you write. And so can you recommend some short story writers, collections, standalone short stories to our audience?
Well, the big recommendation that I would want to make right now is the first story in this. I mean, this is all the anthologies are very good, but this is the 2019 Best American Short Stories, and I just love this first story, The Era, which is by Nana Kwame Adjei Brenya, and his short story collection is called Friday Black. And if you're someone actually who is interested in mixing genres, he is a good person to read, and that story is really great to read. It's set sort of in a futuristic era, but it's making a very deep commentary on what we're going through right now. And it blew me away. It's amazing. So that's gonna be my recommendation. But there are I have a lot of favorites. I could go on forever, but read that one.
Thank you.
That sounds great. I've not read that yet, so I'm gonna have to put that on my list too. I've really been recently into some of the collections that have been coming out that are not exactly linked short stories in the traditional sense, in the sense it's not necessarily kind of novelistic in terms of how it builds, but they have some sort of connective tissue. So Carmen Machado's collection, for example, there's this kind of stylistic connective tissue of her work that I love. Brian Washington's collection Lot, which was a big hit last year or the year before, is set in these different areas of Houston. And even though there's kind of different characters and a few of them recur, by the end you have this really kind of panoramic sense of these areas of the city. It's kind of beautiful and amazing. And similar to what Antonio Ruiz Camacho did in his book that came out a couple of years ago, that kind of takes this family from Mexico and kind of follows the different parts of them as they kind of filter into the United States in different places. So it gives you, each story is really distinct and could be published on its own, but by the end you also feel like there's this kind of larger kind of arc. And so I'm really into those collections right now.
Yeah, and off of that, I'll also just recommend Sabrina and Corina by Callie Fajardo and Steen. It is so beautiful.